It's really nice to have you in the studio again today.
Oh, I always love being here.
It's great. We've had a number of projects that we've been working on together.
We have.
Here in the Wesselmann studio, and I know that you enjoy coming here doing research. We're not too far from where Tom went to school, right? Here at the Cooper Union.
Yes, which is where it all starts for him.
So Susan, let's talk about one particular Great American Nude painting, Great American Nude number 53, which is a really large painting. It's 10 feet tall and 8 feet wide, painting from 1964. And this painting does include collage elements as well as painterly areas. Can you describe a little bit about how this painting might have been made?
Well, it's 2 panels, first of all, and in fact, it is, I think, the second largest Great American Nude that he makes. The first one being number 51, which it has one more panel to it. And that's a full torso across the whole canvas. This is cropped to the head of the figure and just below her breast. There are only 2 collage elements included in it. And really what we see in the picture, above and beyond the collage elements, which I'll get to in just a minute, is the surety of the paint that Tom is using. And when he first started out making the Great American Nudes, he was so uncomfortable about being a painter, which is why he collaged so much. But in this 4-year period of making these pictures, he's really learned how to paint. And you see it so beautifully rendered here. It's just fantastic. I mean, the blue, the perfect tonality of her flesh, the nipples, the way he's painted the oranges, and the vase of flowers that sit on the table. And of course, typically with Tom, it's stacked in a way that you don't understand the perspective properly.
The painting reminds me of one of the portrait collages that you had pointed out before, which Tom thought of as the sort of beginning painting, the sort of beginning of his mature phase, portrait collage number 1.
Yes.
And that small painting, which was a study or related to the Memley painting that he had posted on his wall,
in the
had
studio.
all of the elements that this painting does. There's a figure in an interior with a window showing a view outside of the landscape, a picture hanging on the wall, and then we have a still life on the table, and you were pointing out the oranges and flowers. But it's interesting to see this formula is so persistent within the career.
Well, as you said, it's set up with portrait collage number 1 and based on that Hans Memling portrait of a man that's in the Met. Tom wanted to be an abstract expressionist painter when he came to New York, but he realized he couldn't do that. So he found his own language and vocabulary and working in collage and ultimately learning to paint with such a surety as you see in GAN 53. But all of those motifs, the view through the window, the still life, they're all there from the very beginning. And he just, over the course of the 100 examples of the Great American Nude, just keeps reworking it and experimenting with it in very different ways. And by the time that this picture is made in 64, it's the culmination in many respects. And he goes in a very different direction after this. Let's talk about the erotic aspect of this, though, because this is a moment where Tom is really exploring the sexualness of the Great American Nudes.
It's a part of the times, right? Critics have spoken about this sort of period in history, the shift from the 50s into the 60s, and there was both a revolution in terms of the sexual liberation that was going on, that was certainly something that was on Tom's mind, as well as the sort of shift in terms of painting ideas.
Absolutely. I think he's very much part of the time and following it. At the same time, I think his own personal life very much directs a lot of where his head is and how he approaches the canvas. When he first starts painting, he's married but on the brink of a divorce from his first wife. He meets a very attractive young woman at Cooper Union, Clara Shelley, who becomes his girlfriend. And the exploration of the 2 of them together as a couple, you know, obviously privately, I think affected how he started to paint and to approach the nude itself. And I think we know, or at least Tom has been on record, that he was, in many respects, depicting her. She became an every woman for him.
Right, it's from something deeply personal. The scale is really significant, and it makes me think about the painters from the previous generation in terms of what they were trying to do with scale. And do you think he's trying to adopt that scale from the abstract expressionist painters that he was so enamored of, or do you think he was looking to something else?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think that his interest in using billboard materials, obviously then started to dictate the size of the works he was making, because the images he's cutting out are substantially larger.
In 1980, Wesselmann wrote an autobiography and recounted the history of the work that he had done during those first 20 years. And he said something actually very interesting about the collage material that he was using. He said, during 1962, Wesselmann became aware of billboards and began writing letters to companies whose billboards he liked. When a new billboard arrived and was spread out on the floor, it was immensely exciting. The size, the huge scale dot printing technique, and the fact of suddenly being in possession of these images and being able to use them, cars, girls in bathing suits, countrysides, sandwiches, and many kinds of products. It was frustrating because he got to use so little of it. Within a year, he had moved through that phase of his work. It's interesting to hear Tom write about his own work and his process, and to hear him talk about the billboards and how excited he was about this material. But also it was a way of him introducing new kinds of imagery that he might not have been able to paint.
It's true. He really goes gung-ho into the billboards, starting in end of 62 or something. I think also it was an expediency thing, because it meant he didn't have to paint it. He could just cut it out and develop an entire story around the collage elements.
He seemed to really relish, really enjoy the contrast between the printed pattern of the images against the sort of hand-painted areas that he had painted. Do you think there's something about that idea of working both with machined images and handmade images, and him putting them side by side? Do you think there's something significant that he was trying to say with that?
Well, I think he was also looking at his contemporaries, and some of them were working in a much more mechanical mode, say Warhol with his silkscreen paintings. But Tom still held fast to being a painter. And the kind of advent of consumerism that was going on after the Second World War, which really exploded in the 60s, it's just, he's very much a product of his own time, I think.
It's true that a lot of the material that Tom collages is from the time when he was making the painting. So we see collage elements from the 1960s. But some of the works, like Bedroom Blonde with TV, has a real television in it, and then it would include programming from the time when you were looking at the painting. So in that case, you have an image that has current events on it, and it doesn't have that nostalgic element to it.
So it really brings it forward to today.
It really does.
Yeah.
And also then it keeps that sort of shock of the everyday within the painting.
Yeah. It's interesting you use the word shock element, because that was something that Tom was very interested in always introducing into the works. He wanted people to have that tension, because for him, he found that very exciting. And I know when I first started doing the research on the Great American Nudes and was reading a lot of his interviews, he would talk about the aggressiveness of the pictures.
Right, he's talking about an intensity of feeling that comes from seeing this picture. And one of the things that we talked about with Great American Nude number 53 is the scale of the picture, that it's so large. And not only is it a large picture, but the view of the woman in the painting is closely cropped. So the scale is very large on both counts. And Wesselmann talked quite a bit about scale. In an interview with Irving Sandler, he was discussing this idea, and I think said, what's interesting about scale is historically still life, for example, has a certain reality, and the picture is scaled to real life, as though you were literally looking at the real thing, only in painted version. But when you paint real big, you're throwing away that whole pretense. You're no longer suggesting it's real life, it's completely different. And I realize a 12-foot nude has no erotic meaning, no erotic appeal whatsoever. I was desperately trying to make it something more. I was using still life as an excuse to make some kind of peculiarly intense sort of thing. I was fascinated, I guess, with the end product, whatever it was, whatever validity its strange intensity had.
I think what's very interesting is when he talks about making something so large it lost its erotic appeal. What is interesting about GAN 53 and GAN 51, which are the slightly larger one, the extra panel, those are the only two pictures he paints like that. He very quickly got that that wasn't working for him, and he moved into something else. So it's as if he was coming up to that and then realized he achieved it and moved on.
I think, pointing out the iconography and how you could read these elements as sexual. I mean, Wesselmann did study psychology and was certainly aware of what things might mean, and does put things in there to try to sort of pique your interest. Even when we were discussing the star and the fact that in this particular painting the star is cropped, he knows you will still recognize it as a star and probably will then also think about the flag, given it's a white star on a blue field.
Yes, but he is always very quick to kind of unwind what the viewer may read into the picture. And I think the exhibition includes one or two examples of the little Great American Nudes, which inform the first Great American Nudes in '61. And those also come out of these early collages that he's making, the small nudes and the portrait collages. And he realized at a certain point, and this is at a time when he's living in a 10 by 10 foot studio / apartment with the bathtub in the kitchen, which was standard for those days. And he realized that the smallness had to get bigger. And that's when he moves to that 48-inch square style of panels that all the Great American Nudes are made on. But 3 years into the series, he's really taken it on. He was very process-oriented. He drew all the time. He sketched out a lot of his ideas. Sometimes they find themselves directly in the painting, sometimes they don't. But it's all part and parcel of his process.
Right, drawing was a very important part of his process. And even with Great American Nude number 53, there are pencil studies for this work that we have in the estate that we've examined together. And one of those actually has the gridded lines on it. So you can tell from the drawing that he took that same composition and made a similar scaled grid on his large painting and then transferred the elements that way, already knowing what the collage elements were, because of course those couldn't change.
Well, unless he had multiple copies of them. But it's interesting, the very first Great American Nude starts out as a little Great American Nude, and the way that he enlarges, and you and I even sat and measured each element to understand the proportion that was needed to go from this, 6 by 8 little collage to a 48-inch square picture of exactly the same imagery.
Yeah, it was amazing to measure each element
Yeah.
and sort of see how precisely he scaled that work up. Do you think Great American Nude number 74 is related to this work that we've been talking about, Great American Nude number 53, which also has a cropped torso?
Well, I think the relationship is in the cropping of the torso, but what makes it very different is that it's dimensional and it's made out of vacuum formed plastic. And Tom became really engaged with that from '65 on. And those are the marked differences between them. But I think, doesn't 74 also have a number of variations?
Exactly.
Yes.
So they have different hair color, different skin color. So there are, I believe, 12 variations that were made from the same form.
You see it again when he does that series of vacuum forms, Great American Nude 84, I believe it is, where the stockings change. They're blue stockings or black stockings, and I think the hair is also changing in those too. It's interesting. Let's talk about the smoker.
The cutout mouth is something that appears in a number of the Great American Nudes. We see it here in Great American Nude number 53.
And I think that came about too from him observing one of his studio assistants and her smoking a cigarette. Yeah, but it is interesting that it's zeroing in, that kind of a tight focus that develops probably out of the way that he uses the mouse in Great American Nudes.
Yes, it does seem like he's thinking or has absorbed the kind of scale that comes from billboards and advertising images. And this work is all painting. There's no collage elements in the smoker painting. But making painting on a billboard scale and sort of adopting strategies from billboards and advertising and then bringing them into the arena of painting.
What's also interesting is there are shaped canvases, and that was something that was sort of in vogue in the mid-'60s, that when the smokers start.
Right, the shape of the canvas is determined by the shape of the mouth.
Yes.
And then there are still cutting involved, just like in the collage, in terms of the top edge of the painting is ruler straight, just like the bottom, as though it's been cut out of something. Another series of works that's included in the exhibition are a few examples from the bedroom painting series. There's a large bedroom face painting, number 41, which shows a woman's face by a bedside table lamp and a small still life there. Mm-hmm. And then there's also one of the cropped bedroom paintings. It's a bedroom breast, which also has an orange, and you were mentioning how important the orange was as a piece of iconography within Tom's body of work.
Well, that very much relates to the Great American Nude 53. It's cropped like that. It includes the similar fruits. And I think Tom moves rather seamlessly from the Great American Nudes into the bedroom paintings. And perhaps for him it was just a different way to continue the exploration of the female body, but in a more of a domestic setting, by calling them bedroom paintings.
The view that we're given is much closer up. The still life elements are much larger, and we only see a portion of the nude woman's body.
Mm-hmm. I think those pictures are done in the late 60s and early 70s, right? And I think that's where his focus was. Jeffrey, it's been such a pleasure talking with you about Wesselmann's nudes today. Thank you for that opportunity.
I'm glad you could come.